Chernobyl. There is a test that was supposed to make a nuclear power plant safer. It had already failed 3 times. On the night of April 25, 1986, they ran it a 4th time. For years, Soviet engineers had identified a gap in Chernobyl's safety system. If the reactor suddenly lost external power, the backup diesel generators took 60 to 75 seconds to activate. 60 to 75 seconds with no cooling in a nuclear reactor is a very long time. The solution they designed was clever. Use the leftover spinning momentum of the turbines to power the cooling pumps during those critical seconds while the generators started up, a bridge between one power source and the next. The test had been scheduled for the daytime crew, but it was delayed by 10 hours because Kiev needed the electricity. By the time they got clearance to proceed, the experienced day crew had gone home. The night crew, less familiar with the procedure, took their place. The reactor was also running at dangerously low power. Operators knew this. They pushed through anyway. The test had been postponed too many times. At 1:23 a.m., they initiated the sequence. To prevent interference with their data, they manually blocked the emergency cooling system, the one thing that could have stopped what came next. 20 seconds later, the power began climbing. Fast, uncontrollably fast. The operators hit the emergency shutdown button. The explosion that followed blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid straight off its housing. A second explosion sent a column of radioactive material 9 kilometers into the atmosphere. The fire burned for 10 days. The radiation released was 400 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Over 350,000 people were permanently evacuated. Measurable radiation fell across Europe. The full death toll, accounting for long-term cancer cases, is still being debated today. But here's the detail that makes this story something else entirely. The test never worked. Not that night, not any of the 3 times before. The turbines never produced enough power to run the cooling pumps during the gap. The entire reason they ran the test, the problem they were trying to solve, was never solved. They destroyed a city trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed the way they were trying to fix it. The Titanic. There is a version of this story where everyone survives. It almost happened. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic was cutting through the North Atlantic at 22 knots. The wireless operators had received at least 6 iceberg warnings throughout the day. Some reached the bridge, others never left the radio room. The operators were too busy sending personal messages for wealthy passengers to pass them along. At 11:39 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet saw it, a dark shape rising from the water directly ahead. He had no binoculars. The binoculars assigned to the crow's nest had been locked in a storage cabinet in Southampton before departure. The officer who had the key had been transferred off the ship at the last minute. No one thought to find a replacement pair. Fleet called the bridge immediately. First Officer Murdoch gave the order, hard to starboard, full reverse on the engines. The ship began to turn. For 37 seconds, it looked like it might clear. It didn't. The bow caught the iceberg just below the waterline, buckling the hull plates across 5 compartments. The Titanic was designed to survive 4 flooded compartments, not 5. One compartment made the difference between a close call and the most famous shipwreck in history. There was a second error, built years earlier into the ship's design. The watertight compartments had walls that stopped short of the top deck. Once water filled one compartment to the rim, it simply spilled over into the next. The flaw had been accepted during construction because fully sealed compartments would have reduced cargo space. And then there was the third error, the one that sealed the outcome for over 1,000 people. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Enough for 1,178 people. There were 2,224 on board. British maritime regulations at the time only required capacity for 962. The Titanic actually exceeded the legal requirement. Those regulations had not been updated since 1894. Nobody had bothered to check. 1,517 people died. In water that was -2 degrees Celsius, most of them within 2 hours of impact. Not because of one mistake, because of a chain of small ones that nobody ever connected. The 4 Pests campaign. In 1958, the Chinese government declared war on sparrows, not metaphorically. An actual, organized national campaign to eliminate the Eurasian tree sparrow from the country. Mao Zedong had decided the birds were eating too much grain. China needed that grain. The math seemed simple. Citizens across the country were mobilized. Schools, factories, and government offices sent workers out in organized groups. Their job was to make noise, bang drums, pots, anything that would frighten the birds and prevent them from landing. Sparrows can only fly for so long before they fall from exhaustion. Nests were destroyed. Eggs were smashed. Children were given days off school to participate. It worked. Within 2 years, the sparrow population across China had collapsed. Then the locusts came. Sparrows, it turned out, did not only eat grain, they ate insects, millions of them, every day. With the sparrows gone, locust and insect populations exploded across the country with nothing to control them. They descended on crops already weakened by other disastrous policies of the Great Leap Forward. Farmers had been pulled from fields to work in backyard steel furnaces. Agricultural techniques had been overturned overnight, and local officials were falsifying harvest reports to avoid punishment, sending food quotas to Beijing that didn't exist. The famine that followed was one of the worst in recorded human history. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 and 55 million people starved to death. The range in the estimates reflects how thoroughly the government buried what was happening. Local officials, terrified of being seen as failures, kept reporting bumper harvests. The central government kept exporting grain to the Soviet Union. Villages were dying while the country's official records showed prosperity. In 1960, Mao quietly removed sparrows from the list of pests. He replaced them with bedbugs. He never acknowledged what had happened. No speech, no apology, no official accounting. The sparrows were gone. The people were gone, and the records were rewritten to make sure no one could prove why. United Airlines Flight 173. Imagine you are the flight engineer on a commercial aircraft. You are 30 minutes from landing. You look at the fuel gauge. It is low, dangerously low. You tell the captain. He nods, says they'll wrap up soon, and goes back to the problem he's been working on for the past hour. You tell him again. Same response. This is what happened on December 28, 1978, aboard United Airlines Flight 173 on approach to Portland, Oregon. The crew had noticed an abnormal reading on the landing gear indicator. The light that confirmed the gear was locked in place wasn't behaving correctly. Captain Malburn McBroom made a textbook decision. Put the aircraft in a holding pattern, give the crew time to diagnose the problem before landing. Exactly what pilots are trained to do. For the next 68 minutes, the entire crew focused on the landing gear. They checked it manually. They radioed the airline's maintenance team. They ran through every checklist. The landing gear, as it turned out, was almost certainly fine. The problem was a faulty sensor, not an actual mechanical failure. While they worked, the fuel burned. The flight engineer mentioned the fuel level twice. Both times, the captain acknowledged it and returned to the landing gear. A third warning came at the 60-minute mark. The captain said they had another 10 or 15 minutes. They had less than 5. At 6:03 p.m., the first engine flamed out, then the second, then a third. The aircraft came down 2 miles short of the runway, clipping trees and a house before stopping in a suburban neighborhood. 10 people died. 23 more were seriously injured. The landing gear had been fine the entire time. The accident changed aviation permanently. It gave birth to what is now called crew resource management, the set of protocols that govern communication inside a cockpit, specifically how crew members escalate warnings to a captain who isn't responding. It is now mandatory training for every commercial pilot in the world. The lesson wasn't about fuel. It was about what happens when a team becomes so focused on one problem that they stop seeing everything else. Experts, highly trained and experienced, can lose track of the most basic thing if their attention gets locked in the wrong direction. Flight 173 is studied in aviation schools, business schools, and psychology departments. Not because of what went wrong technically, because of what went wrong between the people in that cockpit, the Bhopal disaster. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, the people of Bhopal went to sleep next to a pesticide factory. Most of them had no idea what was stored inside it. Tank 610 at the Union Carbide plant contained 42 tons of methyl isocyanate, one of the most toxic industrial chemicals in existence. Somehow, that night, water entered the tank. The exact cause has been disputed for 40 years. What is not disputed is what the water did when it made contact. The reaction was immediate and violent. Temperature inside the tank surged beyond what any instrument could measure. The pressure valve, designed to release at a specific threshold, blew open. A dense white cloud began rising from the plant into the cool night air. The plant had multiple systems designed to prevent exactly this from happening. The refrigeration unit that kept the chemical stable had been shut down months earlier to cut costs. The scrubber that should have neutralized escaping gas was offline for maintenance and hadn't been restarted. The flare tower that would have burned off the release was also out of service. The water curtain, the last line of defense, wasn't tall enough to reach the escaping cloud. Every safety system had either failed, been disabled, or been left unmaintained. The cloud drifted south, directly over the densely packed neighborhoods that surrounded the plant. People woke up unable to breathe, their eyes burned, their lungs filled. Thousands ran into the streets in the dark, not knowing which direction was safe, not knowing what was happening to them. Many collapsed before they reached the end of their street. By morning, the roads were lined with bodies, people, animals, birds, everything that breathed. The official death toll is 3,787. Independent researchers put the figure at 8,000 in the first 72 hours alone, with up to 25,000 deaths attributable to the disaster over the following years. More than 500,000 people were exposed to the gas. Many suffered permanent lung damage, neurological conditions, and damage that passed to their children and grandchildren. Union Carbide settled in 1989 for $470 million, roughly $2,200 per victim. The site was never fully cleaned. Groundwater in the surrounding neighborhoods is still contaminated today. The factory had been operating in the middle of a city of 900,000 people, with disabled safety systems, storing enough toxic chemical to kill everyone in it. And no one outside that building knew: the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. On July 1, 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened in Washington state. It was the third longest suspension bridge in the world. It was considered a masterpiece of modern engineering. 4 months later, it tore itself apart. The bridge had been designed by Leon Moisseff, one of the most respected bridge engineers of his generation. His innovation was making the bridge more elegant, slender, graceful, a clean line across the water. To achieve this, he used solid plate girders along the sides rather than the open lattice trusses that older bridges used. The difference seems small. It wasn't. Open trusses let wind pass through. Solid plate girders catch it. From the first week the bridge opened, it moved. Not violently, but enough that drivers noticed. Locals called it galloping Gertie. Engineers checked the movement and concluded it was unusual but not dangerous. They were wrong. On November 7, 1940, a moderate wind of 64 kilometers per hour moved through the Narrows. The bridge began to oscillate, as it often did, but this time, the oscillations didn't stabilize. They fed themselves. The wind wasn't just pushing the bridge, it was catching the bridge's own movement and amplifying it, in a cycle that physics has a name for: aeroelastic flutter. The road deck began to twist. One side rose while the other fell, then reversed, in a rhythm that grew more violent with each cycle. Imagine standing on that bridge and watching the road in front of you tilt 45 degrees in one direction, then snap back and tilt 45 degrees the other way. At 11:02 a.m., a 180-meter section of the center span broke free and fell 60 meters into the water below. The rest followed within the hour. The only casualty was a dog named Tubby, left in a car on the bridge by his owner, who had fled on foot when the twisting began. Tubby refused to be rescued and went down with the bridge. The collapse rewrote the rules of structural engineering. Every suspension bridge built after 1940 requires wind tunnel testing. The failure modes discovered at Tacoma Narrows are now part of every engineering curriculum in the world. Galloping Gertie didn't fail because the engineer was incompetent. Moisseff was brilliant. It failed because the failure mode it encountered had never been seen before in a structure of that kind. Experience only protects you against things that have already happened. The Sverdlovsk anthrax leak. In the spring of 1979, people in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk began dying. The government had an explanation ready within days: contaminated black market meat. Gastrointestinal anthrax, a rare but known illness caused by eating infected livestock. Several people were arrested for selling the meat. Warnings were issued. The story was clean, specific, and completely false. It held for 13 years. In 1992, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and Boris Yeltsin had decided the truth could no longer be hidden, the real story came out. On the southern edge of Sverdlovsk sat Compound 19, a military facility secretly producing weaponized anthrax spores in direct violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention that the Soviet Union had signed a decade earlier. The facility was so classified that most of the city's residents had no idea it existed. On April 2, 1979, a technician removed a clogged filter from an exhaust system at the end of his shift. He noted it in the maintenance log. He went home. The next shift arrived. Nobody read the note. Nobody replaced the filter before restarting production. For several hours, aerosolized anthrax spores vented from the facility into the open air. The plume drifted southeast with the wind. People living within a 4-kilometer corridor downwind began falling ill within days. They developed what looked like flu symptoms: fever, fatigue, mild chest pain, then briefly seemed to improve. Then, 24 to 36 hours later, their lungs filled with fluid and they suffocated. Inhalation anthrax. At the time, a near 100% fatality rate once symptoms appeared. At least 64 people died, possibly more. The KGB arrived at hospitals within days and confiscated patient records. Death certificates were altered. Doctors were ordered to sign paperwork they hadn't written. Contaminated soil was removed. Buildings were bleached. Trees were cut down and disposed of. The cover-up was so complete that Western intelligence agencies suspected an accident for over a decade but couldn't prove it. When Yeltsin finally confirmed the truth, he framed it as a relic of the Soviet past, a mistake, an aberration. Facility 19 had continued producing biological weapons until at least 1992. The filter that caused all of it was never found. The 1977 New York Blackout. On July 13, 1977, at 8:37 p.m., lightning struck a power transmission line north of New York City. This was not unusual. Power grids are engineered to survive lightning strikes. A breaker trips. The load shifts to another line. The system compensates. It happens hundreds of times a year. What followed was different. The strike triggered a breaker. The load shifted. 20 minutes later, a second strike hit another line. Another breaker tripped. The load shifted again, concentrating onto fewer and fewer lines. Each remaining line, now carrying more than it was designed for, began to overheat. One by one, they disconnected automatically, exactly as they were designed to do, to protect themselves from permanent damage. The system was functioning perfectly, every component doing exactly what it was built to do, and the city was going dark. At 9:36 p.m., New York City lost power, all of it. 8 million people in sudden and complete darkness. 12 years earlier, in 1965, New York had experienced a blackout too. The response had been calm. Strangers helped each other. The city waited for the lights to come back. This time was different. Within 30 minutes, looting began. Not in one neighborhood, across the city. By morning, more than 1,600 stores had been looted. 1,037 fires were set. 3,776 people were arrested in a single night, the largest mass arrest in New York City history. Damage exceeded $300 million. The difference between 1965 and 1977 was not the darkness. It was what the darkness revealed. By 1977, New York was financially collapsing. The South Bronx had been gutted by years of poverty, disinvestment, and arson. Unemployment in some neighborhoods exceeded 40%. The city had been cutting police, fire, and sanitation services for years. An entire generation had grown up in neighborhoods that the rest of the city had decided weren't worth saving. The blackout didn't create any of that. It just turned off the lights that had been keeping it invisible. The power came back on at 10:39 p.m. the following night. 25 hours of darkness. Some of those neighborhoods are still recovering. 8 catastrophes. A safety test run one too many times. A pair of binoculars locked in a cabinet. A sparrow. A fuel gauge that someone mentioned twice and nobody acted on. A factory with no working safety systems in the middle of a sleeping city. A bridge that caught the wind. A filter that someone forgot to replace. A city that was already broken before the lights went out. None of these were caused by evil. None of them required a villain. Chernobyl was caused by engineers trying to protect the plant. The Titanic was caused by regulations that seemed fine until they weren't. Bhopal was caused by cost-cutting decisions that looked reasonable in a spreadsheet. The most catastrophic errors in history were made by people who thought they were doing the right thing. That's what makes them impossible to stop looking at. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. And if there's a disaster you think belongs on this list, leave it in the comments below. The next one might be worse than anything on this list.